Okay, so welcome to the second part of lecture 10, which is on rational expectations and policy ineffectiveness. And the key readings for this lecture is chapter 1 and chapter 25 by the book by Mishkin. So let's get started. Now, the idea of expectations is that when you're talking about expectations in a dynamic setting, the impact of any policy, whether it is monetary policy or fiscal policy, depends on how the private sector adjusts its inflation expectations. Okay, um, and let's get started from the Phillips curve from lecture 8, right? There we said that inflation was equal to expected inflation plus something into the output gap plus a supply shock. I've removed the supply shock. That's not really central to the point. And until now, what we have assumed is that expected inflation by E is simply the rate of inflation in the previous period, which is the adaptive expectations. It's basically called adaptive expectations. And that's simply the reasoning that if, for example, I ask you, what do you think the rate of inflation tomorrow is going to be, or next year, you'll say, rate of inflation this year was 2.5%. I guess it's going to be 2.5% next year as well. And when you magnify that kind of reasoning to all the workers and all the firms in the economy, that essentially becomes adaptive expectations. And that assumes that everybody in the economy is basing their expectation about inflation next period only on what the rate of inflation today is, or the rate of inflation in the previous period is. And that's exactly what we have been using up till now. We have been using inflation in the Phillips curve. We have been using the inflation is equal to inflation in the previous period plus the output gap, right? And this represents the inertia augmented Phillips curve. The key idea is that causality goes from deviation in output, that is maybe because of change in aggregate demand that the central bank can influence, to change in inflation relative to lagged inflation, right? If you remember, that's exactly what I told you in the last lecture, that the central bank can affect aggregate demand by changing interest rates. It can move it up or down. That will change output. If interest rates are low, it'll make output go greater than equilibrium rate of output. If interest rates are high, it'll make output be less than equilibrium rate of output. And consequently, depending upon whether output gap is positive or negative, it will increase or decrease inflation. That's the whole setup. Interest rates, output, inflation. Now, to show you the idea of adaptive expectations in graph, let's carry on forward with the same example that I showed you before, right? We have this output inflation graph. Initial point was A, bliss point at inflation at 2%, output at Y bar. Now the central bank says the bliss point is A nu, where inflation doesn't change, the target inflation doesn't change, but output target is now higher than the equilibrium rate of output. As before, the central bank chooses point B, right? This is the point B. If you draw a vertical line, you will see that output was actually greater than the equilibrium rate of output in this case, right? Now, corresponding to our reasoning, we now know that inflation in the next period will be based on what the inflation this period was plus this output gap. So it will increase, right? So inflation in the next period, the Phillips curve in the next period would be this dashed red line. It'll be higher because there was some positive output gap. Now, even at this point, if you draw another vertical line, you'll see that output is still greater than the equilibrium rate of output, although the gap has reduced, right? But still higher. So what it would mean is that inflation in the next period would still have to be higher, at least a little higher than what it was in the previous period, right? Because output is still greater than the equilibrium rate of output. So, the Phillips curve would shift even more towards the left. And that this now would correspond to another point which is still a bit higher than the equilibrium rate of output. And if we just continue on with this same reasoning, what we will understand is that over a few periods, the economy will eventually reach the point C, where inflation has increased to 4%, and now there is no output gap. And because there is no output gap, inflation doesn't increase or decrease, and the economy is in the equilibrium. Why? Because output is at its equilibrium rate of output, and as the inertia augmented Phillips curve shows, there is no change in inflation. Right? There's no output gap. Inflation is where it is supposed to be, at 4%. So this essentially is the key idea of adaptive expectations, that if the economy is having adaptive expectations, then expansionary monetary policy can have increase in output, and that output increase can actually persist for quite some time before the economy moves back to the equilibrium rate of output. But the cost obviously is the fact that inflation in equilibrium, in the new equilibrium C, would be persistently higher than what it was before. That's the idea. Okay? Now, what is rational expectations? We have introduced this before as well, but let's just go through it one more time. Now, the idea is that agents in the economy optimally form expectations using all available information, where the information set is notated as omega. So the idea is that inflation expectations is equal to the expectation operator, expectation of inflation, conditional on whatever information people can find in the period before it, okay, which is omega minus 1. And since agents are forward-looking, both wage and price setters, that is firms and workers, in the example discussed above, will rationally expect a higher inflation in future due to an anticipated expansionary monetary policy, right? So the idea is, if you're talking about rational expectations and people know that the central bank is is going for a expansionary monetary policy, they will be able to process all the things that we just did in adaptive expectations. And the implication is that they will know that given that the objective of the central bank has changed to a new, inflation should actually be revised, or expectation of inflation's next period should be revised to 4%. Okay? So the implication is that the expected inflation is equal to actual pi that we'll achieve in equilibrium, barring any shocks. So again, any unforeseen shocks may change actual inflation from expected inflation, but if there are no shocks, then inflation that is expected should actually be what the inflation in the next period will be. So we can rewrite the Phillips curve, which is this, pi equal to pi e plus gamma y minus y bar, as this, y is equal to y bar plus 1 upon gamma pi minus pi e. And this is called the Lucas surprise supply equation. It's basically the same as Phillips curve equation. It's just a rearrangement, nothing different. But the idea here is that what you are now saying is that output only deviates from equilibrium output if there is a surprise inflation. Okay, if the central bank or the government is able to surprise the economy, the agents in it, only then would be output greater than or lower than equilibrium output. As long as inflation is expected, then pi minus pi e, if both these things are same, would be 0, right? Or a very small error term, epsilon, as I'm saying. Epsilon is a forecast error with mean 0. It's unpredictable and the errors are not correlated. So y would essentially just be equal to y bar, barring any small fluctuations. What's the relevance of Lucas surprise supply equation? Well, the first thing to understand, let me just show you in the graph first and then I'll explain this to you further. In graph, what we are seeing here is that, again, we were at point A, then the central bank said, okay, my new objective is a new, that is, we are pursuing an expansionary monetary policy. Now, if the agents in the economy are having rational expectations, they will know that point C is the point that they are going to achieve eventually. And what they will do to deter the central bank in choosing any output greater than y bar, they'll straight away choose their inflation expectations as 4%. So suddenly the Lucas supply equation, this was usually the Phillips curve equation. Now I've intentionally written Lucas supply equation because the direction of causality has kind of changed. Now people are deciding what inflation should be there, and that will decide whether output will fluctuate or not. So the direction of causality has moved from output fluctuations to inflation fluctuations, and now it's actually inflation fluctuations affecting output fluctuations. I'll explain that further. But the idea is that since now the central bank is facing this constraint, the best thing for it to do is to choose point C. You can see that, right? If even after having this supply constraint, the central bank tries to choose a point, say, with a higher output at this, right, this level, then it's further away from its new bliss point A new. It wants to be closest to its bliss point, and that's only a point C. If it tries to achieve a greater output target, then it would be further away from its bliss point, and that is basically what it doesn't want to do. So it will choose C. And now what will happen is that suddenly, as soon as the central bank announces that it's pursuing an expansionary monetary policy, everyone involved, whether it's the workers, whether it's the firms, all of them say, all right, we know inflation is going to be higher, not by 2%, but we have anticipated the inflation surprise of an extra 2%. So everyone will adjust their prices by 4%. Now, once that happens, central bank is, it'll be best for central bank to choose point C and correspondingly choose the interest rate to ensure that it does not really, go even worse than point C. So in rational expectations, that's the idea. Let me explain that in terms of what Robert Lucas said in his very famous Lucas critique. Now, in the Lucas surprise supply equation that I showed you earlier, causality, as I said, goes from a deviation in inflation from its expected value to a change in output relative to y bar. Now you can see the causality has changed. It's reversed. And while Phillips showed a negative relationship between output, which is output or employment, and inflation, which we have discussed in lecture 8, Robert Lucas, in his very famous paper in 1976, showed that the relationship between inflation and output breaks down if the government actually tries to exploit it by increasing output or by reducing unemployment by accepting a higher consequent inflation. Okay, that's essentially what he showed. What's the intuition behind it? The intuition is quite straightforward. Firms only want to increase the supply of their product if the relative price of their product increase and not in response to a general increase in price level. That's the whole idea here, right? It's only, for example, Apple would want to make more iPhones only if the price of iPhones is going high, not if the general price level is increasing. That's the idea here. Hence, if expectations are rational and prices are flexible, then the policymaker cannot choose any point other than the vertical line at y bar, which is also known as the vertical Phillips curve. So you can see that if the expectations are rational and prices are completely flexible, then the policymaker just had to move from A to C. It didn't really change any output, just inflation increased. And that's essentially what Lucas' critique is saying. And now it's important what I've written in the bracket. I've said if expectations are rational and prices are flexible, or in the long run, if we relax these assumptions. What I'm saying is that either prices are completely flexible and expectations are rational. In that case, in the short run, you will move from point A to point C in the diagram before. Or that will eventually still happen, but in the long run, as prices slowly adjust and expectations are adaptive and slowly adapting to what's actually the true case, right? Which is the adaptive expectations case that I showed you in the graph before that. So the idea is that at least in the long run, you can be sure that the government cannot influence output but through monetary policy. But in the short run, it may, as long as output, as long as inflation, as long as expectations are not completely rational, and as long as there is some rigidity in prices. So so we can show Lucas critique in a form of graph as well. And again, just to restate the Lucas critique, it states that economic relations become unstable when policymakers attempt to exploit them as expectations adjust. The people in the economy adjust their expectations and hence change the structure of the economy. And Lucas was awarded Nobel Prize in 1995 for that. The effect of monetary policy stimulus can also be shown in an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which you guys must have studied somewhere in the first or the second year. But this can simply again be represented in an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. You have the same inflation and output space. This y bar is the vertical line, is the vertical Phillips curve. And let's assume that the central bank, pursues expansionary monetary policy, hence shifting aggregate demand to AD prime. Now, in case expectations are adaptive, that would mean that in the short run, you would reach this point where if you just draw a vertical line here, output would have increased. Slowly, the prices increase and the aggregate supply curve keeps shifting upwards, and slowly but surely you will reach the point where the intersection is at the with the green line, where output is again at its equilibrium rate of output and inflation is higher. Okay, so it's the same intuition that I showed you earlier, except now that I'm showing you in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand plane. What happens if we have rational expectations and completely flexible prices? Then this transition happens just in one period, right? People have rational expectations. They expect prices to have reached this level, and they revise the prices, and that leads to an immediate shift from this point to this point. Okay? Aggregate supply curve simply shifts to the green line, and there's no change in output, except the inflation now is permanently higher. That's the Lucas critique. And that is very closely connected with the policy ineffectiveness proposition. Okay, this is again a key result in new classical macroeconomics by Sargent and Wallace in their 1975 paper, where they say that anticipated aggregate demand policy has no effect on output gap. Okay, and now you can see it. It's quite straightforward, as I just showed you earlier. The assumptions are, again, first, that prices are completely flexible. Okay, the expectations are rational, and there's perfect information. There's no uncertainty at all. If you know the anticipated policy and you have perfect foresight, then inflation would exactly be where it should be. There are no shocks. And the proof is quite straightforward. If you assume perfect foresight, and if you just represent the aggregate supply curve as what I showed you earlier, which is the Lucas supply equation, and if you put pi equal to pi e, you can see that y would always be equal to y bar, right? And it would not be affected by any anticipated aggregate demand policy. So you can see that, right? If we are in the case of rational expectations and you shift the aggregate demand, it's not really changing output because output is fixed at y bar. The only thing that will change is inflation. That's the idea of policy ineffectiveness proposition. What are the implications of policy ineffectiveness proposition? First is that systematic policy rules are completely ineffective for output gap stabilization. That's a very strong result, right? It's basically saying that if you're trying to systematically iron out output gaps, people will anticipate that and it'll be completely ineffective. Second, it says that announcing output gap stabilization policies makes them ineffective. That is, you should not announce them because that will make them anticipated. If it's unanticipated, you may still have some effect. The third is that announcing disinflation policies makes them highly effective and costless. Why is that? Well, let me just take you to this point, right? Now, disinflation is the economy is in equilibrium right here at point C, and then the government says, okay, we are delegating the monetary policy to the central banker, who will definitely not misbehave. So believe us that inflation will be 2%. And if the economy actually does believe, if it's actually credible, and that's a big if, um, what will happen is that the Lucas supply equation will suddenly shift downwards and will intersect point A because it's rational expectations. It's not adaptive. You don't need to sacrifice output to you do disinflation. You can straight away come from point C to point A, just like you went from point A to point C. And in that case, disinflation would be completely costless. So that's a very strong proposition of the policy ineffectiveness proposition. What's the empirical evidence? The empirical evidence is that disinflation policies generally do lead to an economic slowdown, although there have been exceptions where from hyperinflation, countries have managed to stabilize their output at relatively at not great costs. Let me put it like that. And the second is, so that is kind of against what the policy ineffectiveness proposition says, because generally disinflation policies do lead to economic slowdown, which basically means that the government or the central bank does have to sacrifice some amount of output to actually bring down inflation. The second thing is that central bank transparency actually tends to make monetary policy more effective. That's more or less an agreed upon idea within macroeconomists. That is, if the central bank is conducting monetary policy more transparently, it may actually help achieve its objectives. And let me give you an example. The example is quite straightforward. Let's assume a demand shock, a negative demand shock, and the central bank clearly explains to everyone in the economy that they are, lowering the interest rates in order to stabilize, in order to boost aggregate demand. Now, if that happens, and if that, communication is understood well by the private sector, then, it's important to understand how this will work. For investment decisions in aggregate demand, etc., what really matters is the long-term interest rate. And we know how long-term interest rates are connected by the short-term interest rates using the expectation theory discussed in lecture 2 or 3. The idea is just lowering the short-term interest rate, which is in the control of the central bank, does not really lower the long-term interest rates, which are key for investment decisions. That will actually be done by the private sector, because the private sector then assumes that, okay, the central bank is trying to achieve a low interest rates and probably it will continue to do so in the future as well. So the overall expectations of interest rates in the future as well go down, which basically means that with the help of private sector, the long-term interest rates also went down, which eventually boost the aggregate demand. And the idea is that in this case, central bank transparency can in fact make monetary policy more effective. So it's important to take the conclusion of this point of policy ineffectiveness proposition is that it may fail due to a variety of reasons. It may not exist, or it may not completely be true that policies are completely ineffective. Because there's imperfect information, right? People do not have perfect information about shocks and structure of the economy. Second, rational expectations may not hold, right? Because many people may not access or process all available information. And second, people tend to use adaptive expectations or rules of thumbs kind of thing, cognitive biases. And finally, there may be some nominal rigidities, right? Many prices and wages in the real world are preset. So prices are not completely flexible as we assumed in the policy ineffectiveness proposition or in the Lucas critique. So that is the idea of policy ineffectiveness proposition and rational expectations. Let me close this discussion by discussing the idea of time inconsistency, okay, which is again very closely connected to rational expectations. So let's assume that we are at point A, where inflation expectations are rational, right? So this is not the Phillips curve, just the intuition is different. Now it's the aggregate supply curve. Just trying to show that in this case the inflation expectations are rational, and everything is as before. But now what the central bank does is that it says, okay, now these people are very smart. They have assumed, they have taken all information into consideration. But you know what? I'll beat them by giving them a surprise. And once the inflation expectations have been set, no matter what the inflation expectations were, they could have been 2% or they could have been 4%. The central bank can always then, set a new bliss point, and choose a higher output. And if it does that, that is essentially called the time inconsistency problem, because the central bank can behave in the first period to show that inflation expectations are just fine. There should be a 2%, but when the economy actually bases its expectations at 2%, then the central bank reneges, because now it can actually achieve this increase in output, which it otherwise could not have, because they were straight away, the economy was going straight away from point A to point C. It will eventually now in this case as well. But the point is that the central bank did take this short run benefit of getting to point B. And that's the time inconsistency problem. Now, and that's basically what we are saying, that inflation expectations are rational, but the central bank acts with discretion. That is, it chooses desired level of aggregate demand after inflation expectations have been formed in the private sector. And what are the solutions to time inconsistency problem? The first two are commitment and delegation, which are the same things as we discussed in the first half of the lecture. The third is reputation, and all it simply means is that if the central bank is going to interact with private sector, not just over 1 or 2 period, but as we have in reality over many years, then this repeated interaction makes the central bank behave better. Because if the central bank misbehaved for 1 or 2 periods, then the private sector will stop believing it. Okay, it will lose credibility. And if it does that, then inflation may just go out of control, because private sector is not believing a word coming out of the central bank. So it's important then to create a reputation and then live up to what you promise. So I'll stop here today and see you next week. Thank you.